They say some love stories change lives, but this one destroyed an entire kingdom. A queen, born into absolute power, surrounded by gold, loyalty, and fear, was never supposed to fall in love with someone beneath her throne. But she did, and that one forbidden love shattered everything she was meant to protect. Because the man she chose was not a noble, not a king, not even close to her world. He was a slave. And when the kingdom discovered the truth, it didn't just cause a scandal. It sparked a chain of events that led to betrayal, rebellion, and the slow collapse of an empire that once seemed unbreakable. But the most shocking part? She didn't regret it. Even as everything burned around her, she still chose him. In the heart of a powerful ancient kingdom, one built on strict laws, royal bloodlines, and absolute hierarchy, there ruled a young queen known for her beauty, intelligence, and discipline. To the public, she was perfection. To her advisors, she was control. To her enemies, she was untouchable. Her palace stood like a symbol of eternal power, towering marble walls, golden halls, and armies loyal enough to die for her command. Every word she spoke became law. Every decision she made shaped the fate of thousands. But behind that image of perfection, she was alone, because power, no matter how absolute, has a cost. Her life was planned from the moment she was born. Every friendship selected, every meeting controlled, every emotion carefully monitored by advisors who feared weakness more than anything else. Love was not part of her world. It was considered dangerous, unstable, a threat to the crown itself. And so she lived surrounded by people, but never truly connected to any of them. That changed the day the slaves arrived. They were brought in quietly, as part of a royal shipment from a conquered region. Workers, servants, laborers meant to serve the palace without question. They were expected to be invisible, to obey, to exist without importance. But among them was one man who did not behave like the rest. He did not bow his head the same way. He did not speak unless necessary. And he did not look at the world as someone broken. He looked like someone waiting. The queen noticed him by accident at first. A moment in the palace gardens. A brief glance. Nothing more. But something about the way he stood apart from the others disturbed her, not in fear, but in curiosity. Because for the first time in her life, someone did not look at her like a queen. He looked at her like a person. And that single moment was the beginning of everything. At first, it was nothing more than coincidence. At least, that is what she told herself. In a palace as large as hers, it was normal to cross paths with servants, guards, and workers without ever remembering their faces. They were background figures in a world designed around royalty, invisible by design, forgettable by expectation. But he was not forgettable. The queen began noticing him in fragments of time she never planned for. In the palace gardens at dawn when the world was still quiet. Near the water courtyards where servants gathered to carry out their duties. Along the stone corridors where shadows stretched long under torchlight. Each time was brief. Each time it felt accidental. And yet, each time, something inside her lingered long after he was gone. He never approached her. He never tried to speak first. That alone was unusual. Most people in the palace either feared her presence or sought to gain something from it. Every interaction she had was filtered through hierarchy, through ambition, fear, or obligation. But he did none of those things. He simply existed within her space, as if her title did not define the air between them. That disturbed her more than she expected. One evening, as the sun fell behind the marble towers and the palace turned gold in shadow, she found herself walking alone through the eastern gardens. It was not planned. Her advisors would have disapproved. Her guards would have insisted on following. But for once, she had dismissed them, claimed she needed silence. The truth was simpler. She needed distance. From expectation. From pressure. From the endless weight of being watched. That was when she saw him again. He was working near the edge of the garden, tending to stone water channels used for irrigation. His movements were controlled, precise, practiced. There was no wasted motion in him, no hesitation, just quiet discipline, the kind that comes from survival, not comfort. She stopped. He did not notice her immediately. That moment alone felt strange to her. In her world, people always notice her presence instantly. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. bodies shifted. But here, for a few seconds, she was just another figure standing in a garden. When he finally looked up, there was no shock on his face, only awareness, not fear, not awe, just recognition that she was there. "You work late," she said quietly. Her voice surprised even her. It was not commanding, not formal. It sounded almost human. He paused before answering, as if measuring whether he was allowed to speak at all. "Work does not choose the hour," he said finally. There was no disrespect in his tone, no sarcasm, just fact. That response unsettled her more than silence would have. Most people softened themselves around her words. They adapted, adjusted, bent. But he did not. He answered as if she were not above him, but simply beside him in the same moment of time. She stepped closer, without realizing she had moved. "You're not from here," she said. "I am not from anywhere," he replied. That sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have. Not from anywhere. It was not just a statement of origin. It sounded like a life stripped of identity, a person reduced to function rather than belonging. And yet, he said it without bitterness. She should have ended the conversation there. A queen speaking to a slave was already dangerous. A queen speaking alone to a slave was unthinkable. But something about his calmness held her there, as if stepping away would break something she had only just begun to notice existed. "What is your name?" she asked. A pause. Names had weight in his world, perhaps more than in hers, because a name meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was something he may not have received often. "Kale," he said. The word felt simple, but real. She repeated it quietly in her mind. Kale, for reasons she did not understand. It felt different from every other name she had heard in the palace. Silence stretched between them after that, not uncomfortable but uncertain. Two worlds standing too close without rules to guide them. One built on power, one built on survival. She should have left. She knew that. Every instinct of royal training told her this moment was wrong, dangerous, improper. But instead of turning away, she asked another question. "Do you ever wish you were free?" The question left her lips before she could fully consider it. And for the first time, something changed in his expression. Not fear, not hesitation. Something deeper. Understanding. He looked back at the water channel for a moment, as if gathering thoughts he rarely allowed himself to speak. "Freedom," he said slowly, "is something people who have it think about. Those who do not think about surviving the day." That answer struck her in a way she did not expect, because it revealed a truth she had never been forced to face. In her world, freedom was not questioned. It was assumed. Even within restrictions of royalty, she had choices, decisions, voice. He did not. She had been thinking about life. He had been thinking about survival. The difference between them suddenly felt much larger than titles or roles. And yet, instead of pushing him away, something inside her moved closer. "Do you ever want more than survival?" she asked. This time, he looked directly at her, and there was something in his eyes she could not immediately name. Not hope, not desire. Something restrained, controlled. "Wanting more," he said quietly, "is the most dangerous thing a person like me can do." That sentence should have ended everything. It should have reminded her of the distance between them, the laws, the hierarchy, the consequences. Instead, it did something else. It made her see him, not as a servant, not as property of the palace, but as someone who had learned to erase his own desires just to stay alive. The wind moved through the garden, shifting the leaves around them. Somewhere in the distance, palace bells rang softly, signaling the change of guards. Time was passing. Duties were continuing. The world she belonged to was waiting for her return. But she did not move. Neither did he. And in that silence, something unspoken formed between them. Not love yet, not openly, not dangerously visible, but awareness, the kind that does not disappear once it begins. Because from that moment forward, she would no longer see the palace the same way, and he would no longer remain invisible. The first crack in a kingdom is never loud. It is quiet, almost unnoticed, until it becomes impossible to ignore. It did not happen suddenly. Nothing in the palace ever did. Secrets in a royal court are never born in loud moments or dramatic declarations. They begin as small inconsistencies, a missed detail, a changed routine, a glance that lasts half a second too long, something that, on its own, means nothing, but together begins to form a pattern that cannot be ignored. After that night in the garden, the queen told herself it would not happen again. She was a ruler, a symbol of order, a figure who controlled thousands of lives with a single decision. Emotional attachment was not only inappropriate, it was dangerous. She understood this better than anyone. Every lesson she had ever been taught, every advisor who had ever spoken to her, every rule written into the foundation of the kingdom reminded her of one thing: a queen does not belong to herself. And yet, despite that understanding, she found herself returning, not openly, not boldly, but quietly. At first, it was only moments stolen from time that already belonged to others. A brief walk through a corridor that happened to pass near where he worked. A pause in conversation that lasted just long enough for their eyes to meet. A change in direction that seemed accidental to anyone watching. But there is a difference between coincidence and repetition. And repetition becomes notice. Cale understood this better than she did. Or perhaps he simply accepted it sooner. He never initiated anything. Never crossed boundaries. Never spoke her name unless spoken to. But he did not move away either. He did not avoid her presence. He did not pretend she did not exist when she entered a space. That alone was enough to create tension in a place built entirely on control. The palace was a machine of observation. Every hallway had watchers. Every courtyard had attendants. Every movement of importance passed through unseen layers of awareness. Nothing significant remained invisible for long, especially not when it involved the queen. It began with whispers among servants. At first, it was harmless speculation. The queen walks alone more often now. She dismissed her guards again yesterday. She spends too much time near the Eastern Garden. Rumors in a palace do not need proof. They grow from repetition, from patterns noticed by people who are trained to notice everything. Servants are not powerless observers. They are the memory of the palace. They see what rulers forget they are showing. Soon, the pattern became harder to ignore. Cale was noticed more frequently near royal pathways, not because he sought them, but because his duties occasionally placed him there. But perception does not care about intention. In a place where hierarchy defines meaning, proximity becomes suspicion, and suspicion begins to shape truth. One evening, as the sun lowered and long shadows stretched across the marble floors, an advisor entered the queen's council chamber with hesitation in his steps. He was not young nor inexperienced. He had served the royal family for decades, and that made his concern more dangerous, not less. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "there are observations that require your attention." She did not look up from her documents immediately. "What kind of observations?" she asked. There was a pause before he answered. "Concerns regarding your recent movements within the palace grounds." That was how it always began. Carefully, indirectly, words wrapped in politeness to soften their meaning. She finally looked at him. "Speak clearly." Another pause. "It has been noted that you have been seen alone in areas frequented by labor slaves," he said. "Particularly one individual assigned to garden maintenance." Silence followed. Not the comfortable silence of thought, but the sharp silence of recognition. She knew immediately who he meant. Cale. The name was not spoken aloud, but echoed in her mind anyway. The advisor continued cautiously. "It is our duty to ensure the stability of the court. Perception within the palace is important. Rumors have begun to circulate." "Rumors?" she repeated softly. "Yes, Your Majesty. And what exactly are these rumors?" The advisor hesitated again, which told her everything she needed to know. That there is inappropriate familiarity between you and a member of the labor class. For a moment, the world felt still, not because she was surprised, but because she understood what this meant. Rumors were not just words in a palace. They were seeds, and once planted, they rarely remained harmless. They grew into suspicion, then concern, then justification, and eventually action. She closed the document in front of her slowly. "Do you believe them?" she asked. The advisor bowed his head slightly. My belief is irrelevant. My duty is to report what may threaten the structure of the kingdom. Structure, that word mattered, because kingdoms did not survive on emotion. They survived on structure, on hierarchy, on control. Anything that disrupted that balance was not treated as personal. It was treated as political. After he left, the queen remained alone in the chamber for a long time, long enough for the candles to burn lower, long enough for the silence to deepen, long enough for thought to turn into conflict, because now she understood something she had avoided naming before. This was no longer just personal. It had become visible. And once something becomes visible in a palace, it becomes vulnerable. Meanwhile, Kale remained unaware of how quickly things were shifting above him. Or perhaps he was aware, but chose not to show it. He continued working as usual, silent, controlled, present but unnoticed by most who passed him. But there was something different now in the way he moved. A subtle awareness of distance, of observation, of being seen more than before. And he understood what that meant. Being seen in a palace is not the same as being recognized. It is being measured. One evening, as he worked near the outer irrigation channels, another servant approached him quietly, not with hostility, not with accusation, but with unease. "You should be careful," the servant said under his breath. Kale did not stop working. "About what?" The servant glanced around first, ensuring no one was listening. They are watching more closely now. People are talking. Kale finally looked up. "Talking about what?" The servant hesitated again. "About you and the queen." That was all that needed to be said, because in that moment, Kale understood the shape of what was forming. Not truth, not fact, but perception. And perception, once it spreads far enough, becomes more powerful than reality itself. He stood still for a moment after the servant left, not reacting outwardly, not showing emotion, but thinking, measuring, calculating what distance remained between silence and consequence. Because in his world, consequences were never abstract. They were always physical, always real, and always paid by those with the least protection. Above him, the palace continued to shine in golden light as the sun set. Inside it, power was beginning to shift in ways no one had yet fully acknowledged. And between the queen and Kale, the space that once held silence was now filling with something far more dangerous. Awareness. It did not explode all at once. A kingdom never collapses in a single moment. It fractures slowly, almost invisibly at first, like a wall that has been weakening for years before anyone notices the first crack. What looks sudden to the outside world is usually the result of long, silent pressure building beneath the surface. In the palace, that pressure had reached its limit. The rumors that once moved quietly through servant corridors had now reached higher chambers. What began as whispers among workers had climbed through ranks, passed through advisors, and finally entered the space where decisions were made. And once something reaches the decision-makers of a kingdom, it stops being gossip. It becomes a problem. The queen felt the shift before she was officially confronted. It was not spoken directly at first. No one in the court would dare accuse her openly. Instead, the atmosphere changed. Conversations ended when she entered rooms. Eyes followed her longer than before. Even those who had served her faithfully for years now carried hesitation in their posture. Respect remained. But something else had joined it. Uncertainty. And uncertainty inside a royal court is more dangerous than rebellion. Kale felt it too. Not through words, but through distance. He was no longer simply unnoticed. Now he was noticed in a different way. Brief glances that lingered too long, conversations that stopped too quickly, movement around him that felt deliberately adjusted. People were no longer ignoring him. They were measuring him. And that meant everything had changed. One evening, the queen was summoned to the inner council chamber. This was not a casual meeting. It was not ceremonial. It was not optional. It was formal. And that alone was enough to tell her that whatever was coming would not be easily undone. When she entered the chamber, she immediately felt the difference. The room was filled with her most senior advisors, military overseers, and court officials. People who represented the structure of the entire kingdom. People who rarely gathered unless something significant was at stake. The doors closed behind her. The sound echoed. not loudly, but definitively. She took her place at the head of the chamber without hesitation. She had been trained for moments like this, situations where pressure gathered around her like storm clouds, and she was expected to remain steady at the center. "Speak," she said calmly. An advisor stepped forward. He was older, careful. His voice was controlled, but there was tension underneath it. "Your Majesty," he began, "we have received multiple confirmations of concerns within the palace structure." "Concerns," she repeated. "Be precise." A pause. Then he continued. "It has been observed that you have formed an inappropriate association with a labor-class individual assigned to palace maintenance." The words were chosen carefully, but they still struck like a blade. Inappropriate association. Not love, not emotion, not truth, just classification. The Queen did not respond immediately because she understood exactly what was happening. This was not about Kale alone. This was about structure. A queen interacting with someone beneath the social order was not seen as personal choice. It was seen as disruption. "Who has confirmed this?" she asked. Another advisor spoke this time. "Multiple witnesses have reported repeated private encounters." "Define private," she said. "Silence." That silence was enough of an answer. The Queen slowly looked across the room. Every person there understood what was at stake, not just her reputation, but the stability of the system itself. Because if hierarchy could be ignored by emotion, then hierarchy itself would begin to weaken. And kingdoms built on hierarchy cannot tolerate weakness. Finally, one of the council members spoke more directly. "This is not about personal judgment, Your Majesty," he said carefully. "It is about perception. The palace is watching. The kingdom is watching." "The kingdom does not watch my personal movements," she replied sharply. "The kingdom watches everything," he said, "especially its queen." That line settled heavily in the room, because it was true, whether she accepted it or not. She was not just a person in their eyes. She was a symbol, a structure, a foundation of belief. And symbols are not allowed to behave unpredictably. Another advisor stepped forward. "We are not questioning your authority," he said. "We are questioning the stability of influence within the palace." Influence. That was the real word. Because influence is what kingdoms fear more than rebellion. Rebellion is visible. Influence is invisible. It spreads quietly. It shifts perception before anyone realizes it has changed anything. The Queen finally spoke again, her voice controlled but colder. "What are you suggesting?" A pause. Then the answer came. Separation. The word hung in the air. Simple. Clean. Final. But its meaning was anything but simple. Separation did not just mean distance. It meant removal, erasure of connection, a correction to something that had been classified as dangerous. The Queen's expression did not change, but something inside her did, because for the first time, she saw clearly what this was becoming. Not a concern, not a rumor, a decision already forming without her consent. "I will not discuss this further," she said. A quiet tension spread across the room. "That is within your right," one advisor replied carefully. "But the council will be required to act if the situation escalates." "Escalates into what?" she asked. "Division," he said, "within the palace, within authority, within perception of leadership." That was the final layer, because now it was no longer about Kale. It was about her ability to rule without question. And that was the point where personal feeling and political structure collided completely. When she left the chamber, the hall outside felt colder than before, longer, heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension inside. She walked without speaking to anyone, her steps steady, controlled. But her mind was no longer in alignment with the palace around her. She understood now what they were trying to do. They were not just observing her. They were preparing to correct her. And Kale had become the center of that correction. Later that night, she went to the Eastern Garden. Not because she was supposed to, but because she had to. She found him where she always did, working, quiet, unaware of the full weight forming above him. When he noticed her, he paused. And in that pause, she realized something she had been avoiding. This was no longer hidden. Not really. Not anymore. "They know," she said quietly. He did not ask what she meant. He already understood. A long silence followed. Then he spoke softly. What happens now? The question was not fear. It was acceptance. Because in his world, outcomes were rarely avoided. They were endured. The queen looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, she did not answer like a ruler. She answered like a person standing at the edge of something irreversible. I don't know, she said. And that was the moment the kingdom truly began to break. Not with rebellion, not with war, but with uncertainty between two people who were never supposed to stand on the same side of the same world. The end did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with silence. That was the most terrifying part. Not the war, not the rebellion, not the conflict itself, but the way everything began to unravel quietly, as if the kingdom itself had started forgetting how to hold its shape together. After the queen's meeting with the council, nothing was openly declared. No official punishment, no immediate removal, no public confrontation. But in a palace like hers, silence was never neutral. Silence was preparation. Kale felt it first, not through orders, but through absence. The usual rhythm of the palace shifted around him. Tasks that once required his presence were reassigned. Supervisors stopped speaking directly to him. Guards who once ignored him now watched him too carefully. It was not hostility yet, but it was distance forming with intention. And distance in a system like this always means one thing: isolation. He understood what was coming long before it arrived. That is what survival teaches people like him, to recognize endings before they are announced. The queen, meanwhile, found herself trapped in a different kind of collapse. Her authority remained intact on paper. The crown still sat above all others. The court still bowed when she entered rooms. But something essential had shifted beneath the surface. People no longer moved around her with certainty. They moved with calculation. Every word she spoke was now weighed twice. Every decision was quietly judged against the growing tension inside the palace. Not openly challenged, but internally questioned. That is how authority begins to weaken, not through rebellion, but through hesitation. And hesitation spreads faster than any order ever can. One morning, she arrived in a council chamber and noticed something immediately. Not everyone was present. Key advisors were missing. Military representatives were absent. Even the tone of those who remained was different, less formal, more restrained, as if they were waiting for something that had not yet been announced. She took her seat and waited. Finally, the head advisor spoke. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the council has reached a collective concern regarding the stability of current internal influence." She did not respond. She already knew what this was. "This is no longer about observation," he continued. "It is about containment." That word settled heavily in the room. Containment. It meant control. It meant restriction. It meant removing variables before they became threats. The queen's voice was calm. "Say what you mean." A pause. Then the truth was spoken without decoration. The individual known as Kale must be removed from proximity to the royal environment. The silence that followed was absolute, not because it was unexpected, but because it was now undeniable. They were no longer discussing suspicion. They were enforcing conclusion. The queen slowly stood, and for the first time, the chamber felt different around her, not because she was less powerful, but because power itself was being tested. "He is not a threat," she said firmly. The advisor responded immediately. "That is no longer the interpretation of the council." "Then whose interpretation is it?" she asked. Another pause. "Public perception," he said. That answer mattered more than any law. Because kingdoms do not fall because rulers lose power. They fall when perception stops aligning with authority. And once that breaks, everything else follows. That evening, the queen went to the Eastern Garden again. But this time, it felt different. He was already there, waiting, as if he had known. Kale looked at her, and for the first time, there was no illusion of ignorance between them. "It has begun," he said quietly. She did not ask what he meant. She already knew. "They will remove you," she said, not as question. As fact, he nodded slightly. "I expected this," he replied. That answer hit her harder than she expected, not because it was surprising, but because it was calm. Acceptance had replaced fear long before she arrived. She stepped closer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The garden around them felt unchanged, trees still moving with the wind, fountains still flowing, distant palace sounds still existing, but everything between them had shifted permanently. "I can stop it," she said quietly. Kale looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not doubt. It was understanding. "You cannot stop what has already been decided by a system," he said. "Only delay it." That truth lingered in the air. She hated it because it was accurate. For the first time in her life, she was not dealing with a political issue she could command away. She was dealing with structure itself. And structure does not bend for emotion. It only breaks or removes what threatens it. "Leave with me," she said suddenly. The words came before she could stop them, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. Kale did not respond immediately, because that option was impossible in his world. There was nowhere to leave to, no identity beyond the palace, no freedom waiting outside. "I have nowhere to go," he said finally. That was the final truth, not captivity by chains, but captivity by absence of world beyond it. The queen closed her eyes for a moment. For the first time, she was not thinking like a ruler. She was thinking like someone realizing that power does not always translate into control. Footsteps echoed in the distance, closer than before, more organized, more deliberate. Kale heard them too. "They are coming," he said calmly. She opened her eyes, and in that moment, something changed inside her decision-making completely. Not fear, not hesitation. Clarity. She stepped closer to him, and instead of commanding, instead of negotiating, instead of reasoning, she simply said, "Then let them come." The guards arrived minutes later. Not violently, not immediately, but with controlled authority. A formation, a procedure, a removal. And as they approached, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath, because this was no longer rumor, no longer discussion. This was the moment the system enforced itself. The queen stood between them and Kale, and for the first time in her entire reign, she did not move aside. The head guard hesitated. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "please step back." She did not answer. The silence stretched, and in that silence, something unprecedented happened. The structure of authority paused, because even systems need confirmation before crossing certain lines. Kale looked at her once more, not with expectation, not with hope, but with final understanding. And then he did something unexpected. He stepped forward, not toward freedom, not toward escape, but toward resolution. "Do not turn the kingdom into chaos for me," he said quietly. She looked at him sharply, and for the first time, her voice cracked slightly. "It was never just about you." That was the truth neither of them could escape, because what began as connection had already become something larger than both of them. It had become disruption. And disruption cannot exist inside a system built on absolute hierarchy. The guards moved in, carefully, professionally. The queen did not resist physically, but she did not look away either. Kale was taken without struggle, not because he lacked strength, but because he understood the nature of the moment. Resistance would not change outcome, only meaning, and meaning had already been written. As he was led away, he looked back once, just once, and in that final glance, there was no tragedy in his expression, only acceptance of something larger than both of them. The queen stood alone in the garden long after they disappeared. The palace continued around her. The world did not stop, but something inside it had ended permanently. Not a love story, not a rebellion, not a scandal. A structure of belief had fractured, and when belief breaks, even kingdoms do not remain unchanged. They simply wait for the next collapse.